A whole lot of theories have come up about what really happened to Nancy. What's interesting is what Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos said in his latest interview. He stated that they already have a theory. They've had it for a while, but he refused to reveal it. Weeks ago, there were reports of a theory they were working on. That hypothesis suggests it could have been a robbery gone wrong. Some cases just sink into silence. Not because they've been solved or because answers were found, but because the media noise around them slowly fades away. The cameras leave, the reporters move on, the headlines stop, and then people assume the work continues in the shadows. They assume someone is still pushing, someone is still asking questions, and someone still cares enough not to give up. But that's not always true. Sometimes silence comes because the people who should be pushing have simply stopped. It's not that they give up on purpose or stop caring. It's that time changes investigations in strange ways. Time creates distance. And that distance makes it easier to accept that some questions will never have an answer. It becomes easier to file the case away, redirect resources elsewhere, and convince yourself that everything possible has already been done. That's exactly what happened with the Nancy Guthrie case. For a while, it seemed like the entire world was watching. Her disappearance shook everyone. It had those details that stick with you. A woman vanished, with no logical explanation. Without a body found right away or any public suspects, only a family was left to fend for themselves with a sea of questions. There was a silence that grew more deafening every day. People talked about it online and throughout the community. Reporters appeared on the news. Investigators gave statements. Tips came in. There was constant movement. There was a real urgency. It felt like something important was about to be uncovered at any moment. But then absolutely nothing happened. The case stalled not in resolution but in total stillness. The kind of calm that looks like peace from the outside. But on the inside, it feels like total abandonment. It's the kind of stillness a family has to survive in every day. While the rest of the world moved on, Nancy Guthrie was still missing. And whoever was responsible was still walking free. The case had quietly slipped out of the public eye. That's exactly when Brian Entin decides to step in. If you don't know who Brian Entin is, here's what you need to understand about him right now. He's not the kind who shows up when cases are easy or fresh. He's not chasing clicks or cheap fame. He's not looking for an easy story to tell. He's a journalist who pays attention right where everyone else stopped looking. He picks cases back up not because someone hands him new leads, but because he's convinced something is being overlooked. And he's almost always right. When Brian came back to the Nancy Guthrie case, he didn't bring any new physical evidence with him. He didn't show up with a confession in hand or a witness who had suddenly decided to break their silence. He came back with something much subtler and more patient than that. He came back with a simple but profound question in mind. It wasn't the obvious question or the one everyone had been asking from day one. It wasn't asking who did this, because that question had already been raised thousands of times without producing a single concrete answer up to now. He came back with a different question, more measured and meticulous. He came back simply asking, what doesn't fit in this story? It might sound simple or like something anyone would do, but I'll tell you why. It's actually extremely hard to pull off. Being inside an investigation surrounded by evidence, testimony, timelines, and a lot of pressure stepping back from the noise is nearly impossible. It becomes very difficult to gain distance and see the gaps. You end up focusing only on the information you already have. You build your reasoning on what's right in front of you, and slowly you stop noticing what's missing without even realizing it. But Brian noticed what was missing. He didn't come back to this mystery by zeroing in immediately on possible suspects. He wasn't trying to come up with a new theory from scratch. He was doing something much more basic and fundamental than all that. He was going back to the beginning to read every document again, with a completely fresh and renewed perspective. Not to find brand new information, but to identify those points where the existing information simply stopped making sense. Because there's something experienced, investigators will always tell you. If a case stalls, it's rarely from a lack of leads. It's usually because the data hasn't been interpreted correctly. Something was accepted as truth that should have been questioned. A point was treated as closed when in reality it was still open to debate. And that accepted truth becomes an impassable wall. Everything else gets built around that foundation. Nothing can move forward because no one dares to challenge the foundation. But Brian was willing to challenge that foundation. He didn't start with suspects or physical evidence, but with pure logic and the basic structure of what happened. The big question was whether the reported facts actually made sense when you analyzed them carefully and looked at them with complete honesty. This is where the case shifted in tone. Because when you stop asking who and start questioning what doesn't fit, everything starts to come into focus. You notice those small details that on their own seem to say nothing but together start suggesting an unsettling truth. You start to feel out the edges of a blurry picture that hasn't fully come into view yet before your eyes. The first thing Brian noticed wasn't dramatic. It wasn't an irrefutable piece of evidence or a smoking gun. It was more like a splinter, something tiny that simply didn't fit in that scenario that seemed so perfect. Something that gnawed at the official version of events without quite breaking it. He noticed that things were too clean. Understand what that means. In real life, tragedies are chaotic. People panic and plans fall apart. Details get mixed up. Events never go as planned because reality is unpredictable and human beings aren't machines. There's always friction. Something always happens that breaks the plan and throws off the course of a criminal's actions. Chaos always leaves its mark, even in crimes carried out with the greatest cold-bloodedness and the most meticulous care. But when Brian analyzed the timeline of what supposedly happened the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared without a trace, he sensed something was wrong. The events flowed too smoothly. The timing was too precise, and the movements had no interruptions. As if everything had been planned down to the minute, and then executed, without anything, absolutely nothing going wrong in the actual process. Real events don't work that way. They have gaps, pauses, and those small human failures that always leave some kind of trace behind. When something looks this clean, when the timing is perfect and the execution flawless, it can only mean one of two things. Either the story being told isn't accurate, or the person behind it didn't act on impulse, but with terrifying cold-bloodedness. They weren't simply reacting to an opportunity. They had already been there, at least in their mind, going over every move long before taking the first step in reality. Brian leaned toward that second option, and that led him to a possibility that changed the direction of the entire investigation. If this wasn't chaotic or impulsive, if the execution was clean, the timing precise, and the movement smooth and consistent, then the person responsible wasn't a stranger who accidentally stumbled into an unexpected situation in the middle of the night. It was someone who knew the environment they were operating in perfectly, and they didn't know it just superficially or in general terms. This wasn't someone who passed through once, but a person who knew the place intimately. Someone who had been there enough times to understand how everything worked, where people moved, and what time there was activity. And when silence took over, they knew the exits and the normal patterns of the area. They had a complete handle on that setting. This is what investigators call environmental familiarity, and it's one of the most revealing factors you can identify in a case. It pulls you out of the huge pool of unknown suspects and steers you towards something much more concrete, specific, and dark. Someone with a real connection to the location. Someone who had a strong reason to know every corner of the place. That doesn't mean Nancy knew him personally. It doesn't have to be a neighbor or a coworker. Environmental familiarity can come from many different and sometimes hidden sources. A delivery route, a job nearby, or simply a routine that brought him through there, or maybe a deliberate effort. But here's the crucial point. Regardless of where that knowledge came from, this means the crime wasn't random. It means somebody did their homework. And that tells us this was a targeted attack, not something chaotic or impulsive, or an accident where Nancy crossed paths with the wrong person at the worst possible moment of her life. Nothing was random. Targeted. That word alone completely changes the way we look at the case. It radically changes the questions we have to ask now. It changes the places we look, and above all, it changes the profile of who could really be responsible for the act. Because a targeted crime isn't the work of a stranger who got lucky. It's something far more calculated and sinister. It's the work of someone who prepared, observed, made a decision, and then carefully planned how to pull it off successfully. The fact that this case was being treated by public opinion as something random was a serious problem for finding the truth. Because if you're looking for a random attacker, you're looking in the wrong direction and wasting very valuable time. You ask the wrong questions. You chase someone who doesn't exist, while the actual culprit stays hidden in the shadows. Brian Entin understood this perfectly. And it was that shift in perspective from random to planned that changed everything. From impulsive to premeditated. From a stranger to someone with knowledge. That was the foundation for everything that followed. The case wasn't cold because the answers had vanished off the face of the earth. The case was silent because the right question hadn't yet been asked with the necessary force. But that was about to change. Many people believe a crime begins exactly when it happens. The instant a door is opened that should have been locked. The exact moment of the abduction. The point where a life is interrupted without warning. That's where most people draw the beginning. That's the moment that gets reported. The event that gets investigated. The instant that gets replayed over and over while answers are desperately sought. But that starting point is a mistake. Crimes of this kind don't begin at the precise instant they happen. They start much earlier, days, sometimes weeks, even months before. They begin in that period of calm, before any visible act. In observation, in learning, in that slow and meticulous process where someone decides to act. They choose to take the step and then calculate exactly how to execute it to avoid getting caught by the law. The real story begins in that invisible period. And when Brian Entin analyzed the time leading up to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, before the night that everything changed, he discovered something the initial investigation simply ignored. They didn't dig deep enough. But he found clear evidence of a lurking presence. Nothing loud or obvious. It wasn't something that would make you call the police right away, but it was there. A real presence. Something that in hindsight, after the tragedy, started to feel deeply relevant and disturbing. Someone had been there long before. I don't mean they passed through the area once or twice, but that they were present in a strange way that didn't match the normal routine of the place. A vehicle seen on multiple occasions in a spot where it had no logical reason to be parked. Subtle movements that were out of place but not alarming enough to trigger an immediate official report. A figure that blended into the surroundings to avoid drawing attention, although some eyes did notice. Investigators call this pre-incident behavior. It's one of the most crucial and at the same time most overlooked categories of evidence in criminal case files. For targeted crimes, because the person responsible isn't invisible during the days leading up to the final attack. They're there. They move through the area. They gather valuable information. They're testing their victims' routines. They're looking for answers to key questions, like when is this place busy and when does it empty out? What time does the target move? Where do they go? What does normal look like here, so I can blend in without any problems? All of that activity leaves traces. The problem is that those traces are almost never identified as threats until something terrible happens. In that moment, a car parked in an unusual spot is just another car. A stranger hanging around a location is just one person. A face seen several times in a short span isn't automatically labeled as a real threat. Nobody goes around recording every odd detail, because almost always what feels off is just a meaningless coincidence. It doesn't mean anything, but other times it means everything. And the job of investigators and journalists like Brian Entin is to take another look at those small, forgotten observations. After the fact, they have to ask whether those details that were initially dismissed in isolation actually fit together to form a clear picture. Whether the suspicious car, the odd figure, and the repeated presence when placed side by side start to tell a story that nobody could read at the time because nobody knew they should have been looking for it. While examining the time before Nancy's disappearance, Brian finally found those hidden traces. On their own, they didn't seem like anything dramatic. The people who noticed them at the time didn't rush to write them down or report them to local authorities right away. They were the kind of details that linger in the back of your mind for a moment, and then fade, because nothing relevant happens. A neighbor who saw an unfamiliar car but figured it was just somebody visiting at a nearby house. Someone who noticed movement at an odd hour, but decided it probably wasn't anything worth mentioning or reporting. Easy things to dismiss, but they don't disappear. People remember without even realizing it. The details stay tucked away somewhere. And when somebody comes back asking the right questions in the right way, those buried memories rise back to the surface. What came out of those conversations was the picture of someone who didn't show up at the crime scene blind. The perpetrator came prepared. He spent time in that specific environment long before any kind of violent incident took place. He observed carefully. He learned. He came to deeply understand the place and the patterns of behavior repeated there every day. Those rhythms of daily life that few people consciously notice because they're too used to them. But a stranger does notice them. A stranger, moving with a dark purpose, looks for specific information and notices details that locals no longer see because they've lived there so long. He spots the cracks. He picks out the moments of greatest vulnerability. He finds those windows of time where something terrible could happen without any immediate outside interference. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from a single visit. It comes from a constant presence, and that consistency is exactly what the fragments of observation suggested. Not a single sighting. Not one inexplicable moment. But a pattern of small, disconnected observations that on their own were worth nothing. But together they pointed to someone who had been studying this environment with a very specific purpose in mind. This is crucial for the investigation, because it means the person responsible wasn't just present the night Nancy disappeared. He was already there before. He moved through the same spaces. He could have been seen by people who are still alive and who remember even imperfectly what they witnessed. There are potential witnesses to the preparation phase of this crime who might not even understand that what they saw was connected to Nancy. That was an investigative opportunity that hadn't been fully explored. Brian understood it that way and turned all his attention to the cameras. Because this is the detail of the modern world that criminals tend to forget, underestimate, or simply can't fully control. Cameras are everywhere, not just the official ones, not just business security systems or traffic monitors. Cameras at homes. Doorbell cameras. Cameras pointed at entryways, front yards, and the entire visible stretch of street. Small cameras whose owners sometimes forget are even on. Cameras that capture hours and hours of footage that nobody ever reviews unless something happens that makes that recording relevant. In this case, something had happened. When Brian started analyzing the camera landscape in the area where Nancy disappeared, what he found was significant. Not because a single camera caught anything definitive. Not because there was one clear, sharp piece of video that answered every question, but because the cameras, when seen together, rather than individually, achieve something very powerful. They create a map, a timeline, a record of movement through space that can be reconstructed piece by piece. If you're patient and systematic enough to put all the fragments together, one camera tells you only one moment. Several cameras tell you a story. And the cameras in this area viewed together had a lot to say. What made it even more significant was the suspect's behavior in front of those cameras. Because there's something investigators look for when they're trying to figure out whether a crime was planned or just impulsive. They watch how the suspect interacts with surveillance equipment. A truly impulsive actor doesn't think about cameras. They don't notice them. They don't take steps to manage or interfere with the recording equipment because they're not planning that far ahead. But someone who planned, someone who studied the environment, someone who spent time in the area before the crime. That person knew the layout and was thinking about the cameras. He knows where they are. He factors them into his plan. And sometimes when they feel confident or when they think they have no other option, they take action to deal with them directly. That's exactly what the evidence suggested happened. The suspect didn't hide from the camera. He didn't simply avoid it or take a route that would keep him out of frame. He approached it head-on calmly, without rushing, without hesitating, with that kind of focused, deliberate movement. That speaks to someone who had already decided what he was going to do and was simply executing one step of a larger sequence. And then he tried to disable it. Think about what that reveals. It tells us this person knew the camera was there. Not because he stumbled onto it in the moment and decided quickly, but because he had already identified it ahead of time. He had already factored dealing with it into his plan. The calm of the approach and the directness of it were telling. The lack of panic or hesitation points to someone who wasn't surprised by the existence of the camera. He was doing something he had already rehearsed in his mind. But here's the problem with trying to disable a camera. The act itself gets recorded. The instant you reach for it, the exact moment you step toward it. With the intent to turn it off, cover it, or aim it elsewhere, you're already showing up inside that camera's view. Your approach gets recorded. Your face, or at least part of it, is captured. Your clothing, your build, the way you move, all of it exists in a recording you haven't yet managed to stop. Controlling became exposing. The attempt to manipulate the evidence created new evidence. The very behavior meant to erase a record became part of it. That's the detail that changes an investigation. Because it's not just video of a crime, it's video of a mind at work executing a master plan. And a plan, unlike a random act, has an author. That plan came from somewhere. A plan designed by someone with technical knowledge, privileged access, and a very specific capability. But plans, no matter how carefully designed, always have cracks when they collide with reality. There are always those small spaces where what was imagined and what actually happened don't quite line up. Those cracks are what break an investigation open. What the camera recorded was one of those points. It was a moment of visible behavior in a case that was desperately lacking any trace of clear conduct. A moment where the perpetrator stepped out of the shadows just long enough to be partially detected. Not with the clarity needed to answer everything, but enough to confirm something vital. It wasn't random. There was no chaos. It was someone moving with determination through an environment he knew very well. He was executing a sequence of steps, planned well in advance, controlling variables he had identified long before. The silence before the crime wasn't empty. It was actually loaded with meticulous preparation. And those preparations left traces that were only just beginning to be interpreted the right way. Evidence comes in many forms. Almost everyone thinks of evidence as something physical and tangible. Something you can hold in your hand, photograph, or send to a forensics lab for analysis. A fingerprint, a fiber, a piece of clothing, or a recording. Something concrete, solid, and measurable. This evidence exists in the real world, regardless of memory, emotion, or human interpretation. That kind of evidence matters. Nobody is saying otherwise. But there's another fundamental kind of evidence. Investigations often underestimate evidence that doesn't come from labs or detailed forensic reports. Evidence lives inside people in their memories, instincts, and that quiet feeling that something was off, even if they couldn't quite explain why. This is human evidence. It's not what they clearly saw. It's not what they can describe in detail with precise times and no room for doubt whatsoever. But what they felt, what registered in the part of the brain that processes threats and oddities. It's that subtle anomaly in a situation before the conscious mind can process it and put a name to it. Brian Entin understood that this kind of evidence existed here, and that it hadn't been gathered carefully enough. When he talked to the community where Nancy Guthrie disappeared, he wasn't looking for eyewitnesses in the strict sense. He wasn't looking for someone who had seen something definitive. He also wasn't expecting a clear, detailed account of what happened. He was listening for something much more subtle. He paid attention to those moments when people paused before answering. When they said things like, "It was probably nothing," or "I don't know if this is really relevant to the case." But then they would describe a gut feeling they ignored, because they couldn't prove it meant anything important at the time. Those pauses, the hesitations, and half-finished sentences. That's where human evidence lives. And it was all there. Not in one person or in a dramatic story that explained everything, but spread across a lot of people. These were people who were in the area right when things started to feel strange and out of place. People who noticed something odd and then convinced themselves it didn't need to be reported. Individuals who felt a slight but persistent unease they couldn't quite put a name to yet. When they were carefully questioned by someone they trusted, they began describing these small, almost forgotten experiences. On their own, they seemed like minor details, but together they formed something important. Brian noticed a consistency in the accounts. Not in the precise details or the words, but in the feeling. The emotional texture was constant. It was hard to ignore. Several people independently were describing a version of the same disturbing experience. The feeling that something in the environment had changed. That there was a presence that shouldn't have been there. An instinctive alarm their bodies registered even when their conscious minds dismissed it as nothing. That kind of consistency between independent accounts carries a lot of weight. It doesn't prove anything by itself, of course. It can't be presented as solid evidence in a courtroom. But it's a clear signal pointing to something real. Because human beings, when they experience the same environment separately, don't generate identical emotional reactions to nothing. If several people describe the same feeling that something was wrong, then something really was wrong. The question is what? What Brian started to put together was the picture of a presence detected by several people. It hadn't been recognized for what it was. It wasn't a threatening presence in the dramatic sense. It wasn't someone who would set off alarms right away, but someone who simply operated outside the normal pattern of activity in that specific area. A person who was present there with no clear or logical reason to be. Someone whose behavior, even though it wasn't suspicious at first glance, didn't quite match the dynamics of the place. This is a key distinction. Most people, when they imagine a criminal in public before the crime picture, someone who stands out completely. A nervous, aggressive, or clearly threatening guy. Someone who stands out so much, it immediately makes those around him uncomfortable in a totally obvious way. But that's not how cold-blooded planned crimes work. Someone who has studied the environment and learned to move through it without drawing attention doesn't look anything like the typical movie villain. They look like they belong. They look like someone running an errand, waiting for a friend, or simply passing by, on the way somewhere else as part of their routine. They're not invisible, but they don't set off any initial alarm bells either. They live in that uncomfortable middle ground, where nothing they do looks wrong at first glance. But something about them doesn't add up. That's exactly what the witnesses Brian spoke with described. Not a monster. Not someone who screamed danger from a distance, but someone whose presence raised an unsettling question with no clear answer. For those who were nearby, it was someone who felt strange without quite being a direct or dramatic threat. Someone who, if you tried to explain why he made you uneasy, you'd struggle to find the right words to describe it convincingly. It's probably nothing. I don't know why, but something felt off. I saw them, but it didn't occur to me to say anything at the time. Brian heard phrases like these constantly, and immediately recognized what they really meant. They weren't false accounts from people inventing memories late, but the imprecise, authentic language of ordinary human beings. Trying to narrate a real experience their vocabulary wasn't fully prepared or equipped for. Beyond the individual accounts, something new was emerging from those conversations. Something that didn't point to an isolated presence on one occasion, but to a pattern of behavior sustained over time. Because the sightings didn't happen all in one moment, but were spread out over an extended period. Different people on different days, and at various points across the area, all describing something that felt connected. The same model of vehicle was seen by several people who had never spoken to each other about it. The same area appeared in multiple accounts as a place where something felt slightly out of place. The same time of day showed up in testimonies that nobody had compared until Brian began collecting them. That's not coincidence. Coincidence is when somebody sees something once and decides to give it special meaning. Coincidence is a single observation that's impossible to verify or corroborate. What Brian was uncovering was categorically different. He was finding repeated elements coming from totally independent sources. The same model of car, the same area, and the same time of day described by people who had no reason to coordinate their stories, and who believed their individual observations didn't matter at all. When the same details show up in independent accounts, they stop being a simple coincidence. They become a pattern, and patterns fuel investigations. A pattern implies constant repetition. Repetition means it wasn't a one-time thing. It implies somebody was in that specific environment, on multiple separate occasions. It means they had a routine. Even if that routine consisted of carefully studying another person's habits. It means they were observable, traceable, and present, leaving visible traces over time. Even if those signs were small, subtle, and easy to dismiss when looked at in isolation. But this is exactly where something else started to emerge from all the human evidence. Something that went beyond what people had observed, turning into something much more uncomfortable. Something that reflected how the community had been transformed after the dark and tragic event of Nancy's disappearance. Brian noticed that people weren't only hesitating when describing what they saw before the crime happened. They were hesitating because of something much more current and present than that. There was a tone in their conversations that suggested the reluctance to speak wasn't only from a lack of certainty. It wasn't from doubts about whether their memory was reliable. It was about something present, something that existed in the community right now. Something that was making them extremely careful about what they said and to whom they said it. Conversations would cut off abruptly when certain topics came up. People who were speaking freely would suddenly become vague and evasive. Details that were about to be revealed ended up being held back at the last moment. There would be a pause, a mental adjustment, and then a softer, more ambiguous version of what that person had been about to say. It's a recognizable behavioral pattern. In the world of investigations, it has a name. It's sometimes called social silencing. It happens in communities where people feel that speaking freely means taking too high a risk. Where the fear of being linked to the situation or fear of retaliation from someone who hasn't yet been identified or apprehended creates a kind of invisible pressure on any communication. Silence here isn't ignorance. It's valuable information that's being deliberately suppressed. These are people with something to tell who choose not to do it fully, because the price of speaking up seems too high. Because the actual perpetrator hasn't been caught yet. Because that individual could be close by. Because the community hasn't received the kind of definitive resolution that would let people feel safe. Safe enough to speak without weighing the risks. It's one of the most painful and frustrating aspects of cases like this. The information exists. The people who hold pieces of the truth are out there accessible and willing to talk up to a point. But the lack of arrests and the perpetrator's freedom create a climate of caution that limits what people share. They'll go that far and no further. They'll describe what they felt, but leave out the most important details. They'll point to a path without committing to names, faces, or a specific story that could be traced back to them. That limit was hurting the investigation. Because just below the surface of those cut-off conversations and omitted details, Brian could sense the outline of something more concrete, something the human evidence was almost handing over, but not quite. The pattern was there. There was a clear consistency. That collective sense of a community that had witnessed something real and was still carrying its weight was absolutely obvious. What was missing was the willingness to push past that initial caution. What was missing was the confidence that speaking up would do any good, or that at the very least their words would be taken seriously, that they would be protected, and that their contribution would matter. Brian understood this well, and knew that the silence itself was a sign. It wasn't a dead end or proof that there was nothing there. It was evidence that there was a lot left to uncover, and that the conditions needed to find the truth hadn't yet been fully established. The community knew much more than what was being said, and the pressure that was silencing that knowledge was still dangerously active. That meant the source of that pressure was still part of the equation. Everything in this world has a shape. Even chaos has a shape, if you step back far enough and look at it the right way. Even the most violent and destructive events, the ones that seem random and senseless, when they happen, leave behind a clear structure once the dust settles. A sequence. A pattern of decisions that, when analyzed honestly, reveal the cold logic that drove them from the start. The Nancy Guthrie case had a shape. Seeing it took time. It required patience and an unshakable willingness to question everything. Everything that had been treated as settled was reviewed. It became necessary to go back to the beginning and read the evidence, not as isolated data, but as a connected sequence of decisions made by a single mind working toward a very specific goal. But the shape was there. And when Brian Entin started to see it clearly, everything in the case began to reorganize itself. This wasn't chaos, it was structure. And unlike disorder, a structure can always be understood. Structure has logic. It has a beginning, a series of steps, and an end result planned in advance. Someone built that structure. And everything built by a person carries the fingerprints of whoever made it. Even when those fingerprints are completely invisible to the human eye. Let's go back to everything gathered in the previous chapters and look at it as a whole. There was a presence before the incident. A period before the crime where someone moved around the place studying it and learning all its rhythms, identifying its vulnerabilities. That presence was registered by several independent witnesses who had no reason to coordinate their accounts. He left traces in the form of repeated observations by different people on completely different days. A vehicle, a window of time, a location. Elements that showed up in different sources until coincidence stopped being a logical explanation. There was familiarity with the environment. The execution of what happened to Nancy was too clean, too precise, and too smooth to be the work of someone acting on impulse. The timing was very controlled. The movements were too calculated. This pointed to someone who not only thought about what he was going to do, but prepared with enough care to eliminate the kind of unforeseen issue that usually ruins unplanned acts. Someone who knew the space well enough to move through it without any hesitation. The behavior in front of the cameras, a direct, cold approach toward the surveillance equipment, followed by a deliberate attempt to disable them. It wasn't panic, but a cold and composed action. A deliberate action that was clearly built into the original plan. The kind of behavior that only makes sense in the context of prior preparation behavior that demonstrated planning and at the same time generated the most visible evidence. There was the human evidence, an entire community that felt something was strange, even though no one could put a name to it. Multiple independent observations that formed a clear pattern across time and space. Then, the silence, the cut-off conversations, and those details, everyone decided to keep to themselves. A limit on what they were willing to say, which didn't suggest a lack of information, but a clear presence of fear. A fear still lingering. A fear that pointed directly to someone who hadn't yet been removed from the equation. Now, let's look at all of this together, not as scattered pieces or individual observations that may or may not be relevant, but as a connected structure, evidence of a mind that chose a target, analyzed the environment and studied the location, planned. The execution controlled the variables, and afterward kept living in a way that managed to keep everyone at bay, keeping the community quiet and cautious long after the crime had been committed. This isn't the profile of a random act. It's the profile of someone who understood every step he took perfectly. Someone who analyzed the risk and controlled it. Someone who thought about witnesses and knew how to manage them. Someone who thought about evidence and tried to manipulate it. Someone whose total focus in this crime was always control. And that control is key because control doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from experience, from meticulous planning, or perhaps from a combination of both. It comes from someone who analyzed the consequences of getting caught and planned everything to minimize that real possibility. It comes from someone who had a very clear picture of what he had to do, and above all, what he had to avoid. But here's the critical detail about plans built on control. They're only as good as their execution, and execution always collides with reality. No matter how well a plan is built, or how many variables were taken into account when it was designed, no matter how many times something is rehearsed mentally before being carried out in the real world outside of imagination, when you go from planning to action, things happen that weren't anticipated. Small details. Things that look insignificant at first glance. Events. The perpetrator may not even have registered as problems at the time that on their own seem not to matter. But those details exist. They leave marks, and those traces, however faint, are part of the entire criminal structure. They are the points where the plan collided with reality, and the two didn't quite fit the way they were expected to. Moments when something took longer than expected or required an adjustment that wasn't part of the original sequence. The gap between what was imagined and what actually happened, creating a trail that should never have been left behind. Brian Entin believed that gap existed here, and not in a dramatic way, or as an obvious mistake that would be evident. It wasn't something that had been overlooked, but at some point in the events, things didn't go exactly as planned. Something small forced an adjustment. And that adjustment, that slight deviation from the original sequence, left a mark whose importance hasn't yet been recognized. Investigators call this a pressure point, the place in the plan where the structure shows clear signs of stress, where that carefully designed sequence of actions developed a small crack under the weight of execution in the real world. And these points are vital, because that's where deeper scrutiny is most likely to yield a useful result. Where asking the hardest questions about a specific moment or decision can finally give us the answer we've been looking for. The pressure point in this case hasn't been identified with complete certainty, but all the evidence points toward it. It was somewhere on the timeline in that sequence between the period of prior observation and the incident itself, and the actual execution of the crime. A moment where behavior shifted slightly, breaking the earlier calm, where the pattern that had been so consistent showed a small irregularity, perhaps an unexpected delay in his actions. A deviation from the route or the timing that had already been established throughout the entire prior observation period. A tiny detail that would only be visible by analyzing the entire timeline as a connected sequence of events. Finding it required looking at absolutely everything together. And that's exactly what was happening. That's where the case stood at this point. As Brian's work began to bear fruit, the fragments started fitting together. The isolated pieces, witness statements and security camera records, behavioral analysis, and the silence of the town began to connect. Although not perfectly. It wasn't an absolute answer to every question, but it allowed the structure of the mystery to become more and more visible to everyone. The direction of the investigation was becoming clearer. The type of vehicle seen repeatedly now belonged to a much more specific category. Instead of vague descriptions, the time intervals reported by various witnesses were finally starting to narrow down. The area of activity the leads pointed to was becoming much more defined and clear. No single piece of information solved the case on its own, but together they accomplished something very important. Something the investigation hadn't been able to achieve in a long time. They were finally pointing somewhere. And having a direction, however imprecise, is very different from having nothing. Because having a target lets investigators focus. It gives them a set of specific questions to work through. Instead of a sea of endless doubts, it gives them a clear direction based entirely on real, tangible evidence. The truth about what happened to Nancy Guthrie hadn't come together yet, but the pieces could now be put together. And that difference matters far more than it might seem. Because the story of cold cases that get solved years later is mainly the story of this kind of gradual alignment. Cases don't usually get solved by a single dramatic last-minute revelation. They get solved through accumulation. Because someone patient and methodical takes the fragments that were always there and connects them until the structure is undeniable. Brian Entin was doing that work while the community watched. Not with noise or with that urgent, highly visible attention, but with a quiet, steady interest that reflected the open wound this disappearance had left. Nancy Guthrie wasn't forgotten. The people who knew her, who lived with her absence, and who carried the weight of what happened, were still there. They were still waiting, still carrying that unanswered question her strange disappearance had left behind. And now, for the first time in years, it seemed like the direction of the case was starting to change. Not toward certainty, not yet, but toward the possibility that the answer hadn't been lost. It just wasn't visible yet. The structure of the events was there, hidden among the fragments and the patterns. In the small traces left by someone who thought he had designed a perfect, flawless plan. No plan is foolproof. Every structure always has some hidden weakness. Every sequence of human decisions contains the seeds of its own fatal destruction. Because human beings are imperfect and reality doesn't always cooperate with the most sophisticated plans. The mistake already existed somewhere in the case file. Nobody had noticed it yet, but it was there. And the task of finding it, that patient and methodical work of reconstructing the truth piece by piece, was ongoing. Nancy Guthrie deserved that effort. Her family deserved it. So did the community living under pressure. That invisible pressure of an unsolved crime deserved the relief that only comes when the silence is finally broken. The case now had direction. The fragments were lining up. And somewhere in the pattern on the timeline, where the plan collided with reality, leaving unwanted marks behind, the definitive answer was patiently waiting to be uncovered.